It's my pleasure to host and introduce Ronnie Pontiac, who is an author, a scholar, a filmmaker, a musician, an artist, all kinds of stuff. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Ronnie. Okay, and we will probably do some Q&A at the end. So put your Q&A in the chat, please, and we'll handle that at the end. Is that cool, Ronnie?
Yes.
All right, let's go. All right, well, take it away, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mark. And thank you for joining me to celebrate Women's History Month on what is a lovely Saturday afternoon in Los Angeles. Through the prism of some amazing women, we're going to explore the early history of the Theosophical Society, especially in Southern California. Radical ideas, fearless faith, daring declarations. Theosophy was way ahead of the curve when it comes to nurturing female leadership. We're going to look at some of the wonderful accomplishments of Madame Blavatsky, Catherine Tingley, Annie Besant, Alice Bailey, and Christine Stevenson. In Theosophy, all roads lead to Madame Blavatsky. Born in what is now Ukraine, married young and unhappily to an elderly official of the Tsar's regime, Helena Blavatsky would come to exemplify escape from a seemingly unavoidable fate and the art of reinvention. Her grandfather on her mother's side was a Russian prince, an initiate of a lodge of Rosicrucian Freemasonry, allegedly an acquaintance of both Cagliostro and Saint Germain. Young Helena devoured her grandfather's comprehensive library of esoteric books. She followed the advice of another Russian prince, who was a Freemason, to travel in search of knowledge. Rare enough for a man to take up such a mission in those days, but to do so as a woman traveling alone required extraordinary courage. Blavatsky claimed to have traveled for 25 years around Europe, Turkey, Greece, North America, the Middle East, India, and Tibet. Historical records did not exist then for a single woman traveling the back roads and boulevards in search of masters of wisdom, but here and there evidence is found of her presence in places like Cairo. Therefore, what you're about to hear concerning her life may be true, exaggerated, or false. But even if false, it tells us a great deal about Madame Blavatsky. Blavatsky's first trip in search of wisdom took her to Turkey, Greece, and Egypt. She traveled with an American explorer and artist, Albert Rawson, author of books on religious history and initiate of a Druze Sufi order. He and Blavatsky studied with a master in Cairo. Blavatsky attempted to create an organization for research into Spiritism, which was all the rage in France with the Spirits book, a bestseller. But the idea didn't catch on in Cairo. It was in London in 1851 that Blavatsky met her first master, a tall Hindu man, she said, who was there with a diplomatic delegation. She claimed that he told her she should go to Tibet, where she would have 3 years of training for her mission. Tibet was closed to the world in those days, but she tried to enter anyway in 1852. She didn't succeed until 1854. In 1858, she went home to Russia for Christmas, where she apparently demonstrated what today would be called poltergeist phenomena, furniture moving, mysterious knocks, and the like. In 1864, she returned to her travels, giving piano recitals in Transylvania and Serbia. She claimed that in Italy, she was wounded while supporting Garibaldi's liberation fighters at the Battle of Mentana. In 1868, her master arranged for her to visit Tibet again to study until 1870. She described his humble school for the elite just outside the palace of the Dalai Lama. Did she study in Tibet? The Mahayana Buddhism that enlightens a great deal of her work, especially her small but beautiful book, The Voice of the Silence, had to come from somewhere. No books were available then. At this point, she learned what her mission would be. She would use all her skills to support spiritualism in America as an antidote to the materialism infecting the world. She claimed that she then returned to Cairo for final studies in the Druze, Coptic, and Greek mysteries. That's an impressive resume, even if it might have been fictional. In American cities in the early 1870s, occultism, spiritualism, ghost hunting, seances, and psychical research flourished. Henry Steele Alcott, investigating spiritualism at the Ghost Farm in Vermont, made the acquaintance of Helena Blavatsky. A lawyer by profession, Alcott reported that she had impressive powers as a medium. She joined him in journalism about spiritualism. Later, she would claim that she had used her own powers to create the manifestations of the mediums she wrote about in order to write her articles. However, because of the many frauds she encountered, by 1875, she was done with spiritualism. She began writing articles about the occult. As the summer of 1876 came to an end, the roommates moved to Manhattan. In an apartment decorated, and that's Alcott and Blavatsky, with Eastern art and taxidermy animals, they hosted something called the Miracle Club, a salon for lectures and discussions of all things mystical and arcane. Famed inventor Thomas Edison attended. So did Alexander Wilder, editor of Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky's first great book. A physician by profession of what we now call holistic medicine, but they called eclectic medicine. He was also an expert on the esoteric, especially Neoplatonism, and he was one of the councilmen who helped kick Boss Tweed's corrupt political machine out of New York City. Major General Abner Doubleday attended. He fired the first shot of the Civil War at Fort Sumter. He was falsely given credit for inventing baseball as a publicity stunt by Spalding. Doubleday did the first English translation of Transcendental Magic by the magus of Paris, Eliphas Levi. Through the Miracle Club, Blavatsky and Alcott met Irish spiritualist lawyer William Quan Judge. At club meetings in 1875, Blavatsky, Alcott, Judge, and friends came up with the idea of the Theosophical Society. Theosophy, from the Greek word theosophia, divine wisdom, very close to the traditional Neoplatonic theurgy, divine work, remembering or reconnecting or harmonizing with the divine. In Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky rejected reincarnation, teaching that we only live one human life and then we move on to other worlds. But after living in India, Blavatsky changed her mind about reincarnation. And in The Secret Doctrine, she taught that human souls must have multiple incarnations here until we have learned all that this planet can teach us. Why was Isis Unveiled the title of a book that had almost nothing to do with Isis or ancient Egyptian religion? It was not the title Blavatsky wanted. Skeleton Key to Mysterious Gates was her title. But her publisher had a beautiful illustration of Isis nude that he wanted on the cover to make the book more appealing to gentlemen with exotic interests. The first book of Isis Unveiled is called Science. Blavatsky begins by taking on two classics loved by materialists, Darwin's Origin of Species and Huxley's Physical Basis of Matter, which she argues are refuted by the outliers science would like to forget: spiritualism, psychic abilities, the Kabbalah, and the wisdom of ancient civilizations. The second book is filled with sharp criticism of institutional Christianity, which is found wanting when compared to Buddhism and Gnostic Christianity. That book is called Theology. The books intend nothing less than the overturning of scientific and religious doctrines of the day. Isis Unveiled argues that a pure universal religion underlies Plato, the religions of India, all spiritual traditions. This great wisdom of the ancients always existed in every place at every time, usually along the quiet byways of study and practice, but sometimes in the halls of power. We are told that human beings are made of three parts: body, soul, and spirit, and that spirit connects us with the divine. In 1878, Alcott and Blavatsky sailed to India to establish their new headquarters at Adyar with the help of a popular movement there seeking to stop the efforts of Christian missionaries to convert India. Blavatsky was invaluable as a European who considered the spiritual knowledge of India second to none. She so impressed the Maharaja of Kashmir that he paid for her travels to and from India. A powerful leader of the Sikh community also became a supporter of the Theosophical Society. Alcott and Blavatsky officially converted to Buddhism. In Sri Lanka, they were met by huge crowds. In 1880, General Doubleday became vice president of the Theosophical Society. Things were not going well. He wrote a letter to a friend in which he reported about William Q. Judge, quote, like a number of others, he has had all he could do to keep the wolf from his door. Several of our most valued members are struggling for a bare subsistence, and this necessarily prevents them giving that attention to our organization, which it ought to receive, end quote. In 1884, a husband and wife who had worked for the society became disgruntled and quit. They released one public statement after another, accusing Madame Blavatsky of being a con artist. The Society for Psychical Research in London stepped in to get to the bottom of the alleged fraud. They sent one of their most respected researchers to India to investigate. Rumors and reactions inspired by the accusations became so disturbing to Blavatsky, she left India in 1885. In 1886, the Society for Psychical Research report concluded that Madame Blavatsky was guilty of fraud and trickery. Was money from Christian sources paid to the accusers, as a researcher argues? In any event, in 1986, the Society for Psychical Research studied the Blavatsky report on its 100th anniversary and found that it disproved its own conclusions. She had been framed. Blavatsky had intended to fight for her reputation in the courts, but her colleagues wouldn't allow it. The society had suffered enough bad publicity. The demoralized founder was soon in a wheelchair. She lived in various locations among friends in Europe as she began work on her epic, The Secret Doctrine. That same year, Judge presided over the creation of the American section of the Theosophical Society as a separate entity. Abner Doubleday became a charter member. Blavatsky settled in London in 1887. There she began her own Theosophical Lodge, which met in the house of a friend. A law student named Gandhi visited and spoke with her. He later credited Theosophy with helping him regain respect for his own religion while kindling his passion for equality. In London, Blavatsky published a journal she called Lucifer. The use of Lucifer as a positive figure in theosophical and some occult circles caused many misunderstandings. The theosophical Lucifer was not the devil. Lucifer did not have the popular association with the devil that we assume until John Milton's poetic epic Paradise Lost. For the Theosophists, Lucifer was the planet Venus, the morning star which precedes the rising sun, the light bringer, an ancient symbol for a divine messenger. The Secret Doctrine was published in 1888. It covers everything from the origin of the universe to the creation of the planets and Earth's 7 stages of evolution. Humanity is only now, apparently, moving beyond the ultimate crystallization of our planet as matter as we begin the ascent to a purely spiritual Earth. Reincarnation and karma dictate the circumstances of our lives. We reincarnate on this planet until we learn all the lessons it has to offer. In Isis Unveiled, human beings had 3 parts: body, soul, and spirit. In A Secret Doctrine, the human being has 7 parts: the body, the vitality body, the astral body, the animal soul, the human soul, the spiritual soul, and pure spirit. In London, Madame Blavatsky made the acquaintance of Annie Besant, who had been hired to write a review of The Secret Doctrine. Meeting its author converted Besant into a devoted theosophist. Besant was there when Gandhi met Blavatsky, and some have credited Besant with being the first to call him Mahatma. Blavatsky moved into Besant's house in London in 1890, where she established the European headquarters of the Theosophical Society. She also organized the esoteric section for the study of practical occultism. Madame Blavatsky died in Annie Besant's house in London in 1891, a victim of a flu epidemic. She was 59 years old. We'll be coming back to Annie Besant. The Theosophical Society began the esoteric revival that became known as the New Age movement. It revived all things esoteric in a way that had not happened since the Rosicrucian frenzy about 300 years earlier. Today, the Theosophical Society exists in 60 countries. Blavatsky and her colleagues achieved this during a time when it was taken for granted that women were mentally inferior to men. Her eloquent, confident criticism of revered but outdated institutions must have been all the more shocking for having been penned by a woman. Alexander Wilder was often asked if he or some other male of the species had actually written her books, because no woman could possibly be capable of such an intellectual feat. Wilder assured his readers that anyone who spent an evening in conversation with Madame B, as he had many times, would know she wrote the book. The first 4 decades of Catherine Tingley's life were lived in the obscurity of surviving 3 marriages. But then, through her interest in spiritualism, she met the aforementioned William Quan Judge. She had been a member of the Theosophical Society for only 2 weeks when one of its founders, Judge, accepted her into the esoteric section. He was so impressed by her, he referred to her among his colleagues as the veiled Mahatma, the purple mother, and the light of the lodge. They worked together in New York City, but Judge died less than 2 years later in 1896. Because of these nicknames, and because of some papers that were allegedly found when his friends went through Judge's possessions, she was declared the new president of the Theosophical Society in America. She would preside over public meetings at Madison Square Garden. One of Tingley's first innovations was the establishment of brotherhood suppers for the poor. American Theosophical lodges that could afford it would host free meals in the most impoverished neighborhoods. Tingley took the idea to England. On the boat headed there, she held separate meetings for the first and second class passengers and for the poor in steerage. In Liverpool, over 300 of what newspapers called the poorest of the poor were fed. Lodges in other big cities in Great Britain and then Europe began giving brotherhood suppers. Tingley and her theosophists next traveled to Athens, where they fed hundreds of Armenian refugees. They crossed the Mediterranean to Egypt. In India, they established a famine relief program. The grand tour continued as this ambassador of theosophy visited Australia, New Zealand, Samoa, and then at the end of the long journey, Tingley arrived on February 13th, 1897 at Point Loma near San Diego. Even as a child, she had dreams of, quote, building a white city in a land of gold beside a sunset sea, end quote. Not quite 1,000 people watched her preside over the laying of the cornerstone for the School for the Revival of the Lost Mysteries of Antiquity, a, quote, temple of living light, lighting up the dark places of the earth, end quote. Exactly 3 years later, on February 13th, 1900, Tingley officially transferred the Society's international headquarters from New York City to Point Loma. A colony of around 300 people of 25 different nationalities occupied 40 buildings on 300 acres. Point Loma featured Moorish and Egyptian architectural influences. The homestead with 90 rooms had an opalescent green dome. The Aryan temple had an amethyst Egyptian gateway. It should be pointed out that Tingley's Aryan interest was not the same as Hitler's several decades later. The Egyptian gates hid a bugler who would sound the trumpet whenever a visitor approached. They were expected to bring love offerings for Tingley, which usually meant contributions to the cause. Tingley was described by some observers as what we would today call a control freak. One said, quote, "From changing the milk bottles of the newest baby to laying the last shingle on a bungalow, her desire equals a czar's edict," end quote. Costumes were encouraged at Point Loma. Chickens were raised, fruits and vegetables grown, and silkworms cultivated. The community acquired an opera house in San Diego. On the stage, wearing Grecian tunics, lecturers attempted to convey the finer points of theosophical doctrine to curiosity seekers. The LA Times thought Point Loma bad advertising that might dissuade people from moving to Southern California. A series of exposés included accusations that Point Loma residents had a secret spot they held sacred on the peninsula where, quote, "gross immoralities were practiced by the disciples of spookism in their night robes, each holding a torch," end quote. In 1903, Tingley founded the Parliament of Peace and Universal Brotherhood. That summer, she hosted the International Theosophical Peace Congress in Sweden. Over 2,000 people from all over Europe attended. When World War I began in 1914, Tingley, who had recently opened a Theosophical Academy and college, reminded all Theosophists that those attacking and those attacked need our compassionate consideration. And I want to add, by the way, that Tingley sued the LA Times, and although it took a long time, she actually made quite a bit of money when the lawsuit was settled in her favor. In 1919, Tingley opened Theosophical University. All students would learn to play an instrument in a symphony, sing in a chorus, sketch, paint, and act in productions of ancient Greek and Shakespearean classics directed by Tingley herself in a Greek amphitheater she had built in 1901, likely the first open-air theater in California. Those who could afford to send their children to the schools pay tuition, but hundreds of students who couldn't afford tuition received their education at no charge over the years. In 1923, scandal derailed Tingley's winning streak. She had convinced a follower who had become estranged from his wife to fork over $300,000, about $5 million in today's money. The man's wife sued Tingley for alienation of affections and fraud and won $75,000. Robert Crosby had studied with Blavatsky personally and with Judge personally. He had been the leader of the esoteric section for all of New England. In 1900, he moved to Point Loma. Doing so required giving up all his possessions to the community. He found a very different kind of theosophy, one much influenced by the views and preferences of Tingley. At first, he supported her, but he soon grew to doubt her autocratic approach. He also believed she sensationalized theosophical principles. He and others became concerned by the supernatural claims to leadership dividing the society. The masters were popping up everywhere in people's dreams and speaking to them and declaring that they should be the leaders. He disapproved of the preoccupation with hierarchy that worsened under the new leadership. As always, there was too much interest in practical occultism and not enough in philosophy and service. When he left Point Loma in 1904, he went back into the world with no money or property. Crosby got a job in Los Angeles, where in 1907, he and 7 friends founded the United Lodge of Theosophists, a group that would be dedicated to avoiding organizational distractions, as they called it. Its bylaws included a rejection of theosophical authorities and a rule requiring that members write anonymously so as to avoid self-advertising and personality cults. The declaration drew directly from the writings of Blavatsky and Judge. It declares in all capital letters in one spot, the true theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. End quote. Crosby was an unassuming man and a loving, living example of the principle that anonymity can protect communities from personality cults. It's a really interesting character in theosophy. The many articles he wrote never bore his name. His works were never published under his name until after his death in 1919. When he lectured or simply socialized at the lodge, most of the people he interacted with had no idea that he had known Blavatsky or that he was the founder of their community. The United Lodge of Theosophists is headquartered in a humble building, especially when compared to Crotona or Pasadena or Altadena. The building in South Central LA boasts an undeniably noir red sign with white letters, Theosophy Hall. It was built in 1927. The other lodges in this lineage in 16 nations are entirely autonomous. Noticing that the original Blavatsky edition of The Secret Doctrine was out of print and had been replaced by Annie Besant's heavily edited version with thousands of changes, the United Lodge began publishing affordable theosophical books. Classes are still taught there by teachers whose names do not appear on the promotion. Catherine Tingley died in 1929 at age 82 while touring Europe as a lecturer. Her successor, Godfrey de Puracker, encouraged cooperation with the Theosophical Society in India and anywhere else. He closed the esoteric section. His books about Blavatsky's theosophy made her difficult concepts available in more palatable prose. New lodges around the world would bring the Theosophical Society of Point Loma's vision of theosophy to Great Britain, Australia, Germany, Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Finland, Nigeria, South Africa, and New Zealand. In 1942, just prior to his death, Puracker moved the headquarters, university and library, and the press to a new, more humble compound in Covina. In 1950, his successor moved operations to a town in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, Altadena, where it exists today, in two historic buildings, a mansion on Millionaires Row and a library at a different location on Lake Street. The original dignity of the library building is somewhat intact, but surrounded by tract houses and a later decade's anonymous storefronts. Annie Besant was there when Madame Blavatsky took her last breath. Many years earlier, Besant's marriage to an Anglican minister had ended because she could not conform to her husband's devout Christianity. Instead, she became a crusader for birth control, which got her arrested for obscenity in 1877. The great playwright George Bernard Shaw himself introduced Besant to the Fabian Society in the 1880s, where she read Karl Marx and became a popular lecturer and an advocate for women's rights and for reining in the power of the church in the secular world. She was an organizer of the London Match Girls strike. Match girls were paid to dip little sticks of wood into phosphorus, the process that poisoned many of them, causing something called phossy jaw, where skin would eat away and leave glowing bone. After Blavatsky's death, Besant and Alcott took over leadership of the Theosophical Society in Adyar. In 1895, they worked together to create a Buddhist college in Sri Lanka. In 1902, Besant joined Co-Freemasonry, supporting what she considered the important innovation of allowing women to access the wisdom of the Freemasons. With her guidance, the order flourished internationally. In 1904, she appointed Rudolf Steiner head of all esoteric sections in Germany and Austria. Besant was one of the most fervent forces behind the effort to declare Krishnamurti the new world teacher that Madame Blavatsky had predicted. Rudolf Steiner took exception to the idea, and in 1913, he left the society to found his own anthroposophy. In 1917, Besant became the first female president of the Indian National Congress, the policy-making committee of the movement for the independence of India. She was arrested again. However, in 1929, the year Catherine Tingley died, Krishnamurti decided world teacher was not a role he intended to play. He left Theosophy. Though he traveled the world lecturing, Ojai was his home, and he and Besant remained dear friends. Ironically, the man who first noticed that Krishnamurti, even as a boy, seemed to be a possible candidate for world teacher would reject the idea and became an important member of Crosby's United Lodge of Theosophy, where personality cults were not allowed. The principal founder of Crotona Colony was Albert Powell Warrington, a lawyer and banker who became a theosophist in 1896 and who was president of the society from 1912 to 1920. We can get a glimpse into his world by considering his experiences when touring with Annie Besant as she gave lectures across America. He said they had a sort of game. He would guess which master had influenced Besant in which part of her speech. He claims to have usually been correct. Besant herself believed the masters spoke through her. Besant and Warrington traveled in England, France, Australia, and India. In 1910, Besant and Warrington were talking about a theosophical colony. Warrington initially chose Jamestown, Virginia, for the Pythagorean community he envisioned as an example to America. Besant suggested Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, or Mexico. Warrington traveled for several months looking at possible sites. He decided on Southern California. First, he favored a site in Pasadena, then another in Alhambra, then one outside but near Los Angeles itself. In December 1911, he bought a large piece of the Hastings Ranch in the hills of Lower Beechwood Canyon near the eventual location of the Hollywood sign. Warrington made local headlines when he bought the land and announced the creation of Crotona, known as the Place of Promise, named after Croton, where Pythagoras taught. Here, the Theosophical Society and the esoteric section would have their new headquarters. He explained to a reporter that, quote, "We chose this place because it is ideally situated. California furnishes an unsurpassed climate, and Los Angeles is the metropolis of a great melting pot from which is destined to emerge soon a new race, a people caused by the fusing of races now going on in the country. This will be the new American race, in whose hands will rest the solving of the problems now confining the world. That race will need wise guidance and great wisdom for the task. There must come a great world teacher, and Theosophy will prepare the minds of men for his message," end quote. Even the kitchen would be organized differently. Long hours demanded of employees had made the fine art of cooking a despised drudgery. The help would work in 4-hour shifts, one for each meal. There would be classes giving the theosophical view of Christianity and of science, as well as classes on vegetarianism. "We are not offering a religion," Warrington said, "but a philosophy of life." Annie Besant was manager of the project, but Crotona would have its own committee to make day-to-day decisions. Theosophists began planting trees, especially date palms and eucalyptus. The horoscope for the laying of the cornerstone of the Crotona Library in 1912 was astrologically calculated in advance. It has Neptune and Mercury in the 10th house, favoring a career of communicating the mysterious, mystical, and spiritual, while Sun and Venus in the 9th house of higher learning promised light and harmony, as well as trips to or from foreign countries. At first, existing ranch buildings were remodeled, but the need for housing and lecture space led to the construction of Crotona Inn, which opened in the spring of 1913, followed by Crotona Court, the Grand Temple of the Rosy Cross, a lecture hall seating about 300, and the domed esoteric section, meeting and meditation room, all perched upon a hill in Hollywood with a straight-on view of the new city and the surrounding flats and rolling hills, traversed then by only a few roads. The compound itself, more than an acre, the whole piece of land was like 15 acres, although I've also heard 11, included a lotus pond, a sundial, a tea house, a lawn for croquet, an orange orchard, a vegetable garden, a grove of avocado trees and another of olive trees, a garden in the Italian style, a hill of eucalyptus, and Besant Park to honor Annie Besant. They're planning to add a temple of tolerance. Crotona Flight, a huge flight of stairs with a spectacular view of LA, brought visitors from Vista Del Mar Avenue up to Crotona, and many commented that they felt they were ascending into spiritual realms. The rectangular white severity of the science building evoked the seriousness of the task of exploring phenomena science resisted investigating. A Moorish mansion, Spanish revival homes, and classic California bungalows made Crotona an eclectic architectural collection. The wealthier Theosophists built homes on the property for top donors or nearby for those who were less generous. All those who were eager to be involved in what was hyped as the modern Athens. Imagine that, Los Angeles is the modern Athens. Services at Crotona involved a combination of Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist beliefs and practices. Lectures for the public pondered the after-death experiences of soldiers killed in World War I, a subject still on the minds of many. Esperanto, the intended universal language, was taught at Crotona alongside details about the human aura. According to the charter of 1915, Alice Bailey was one of 15 founding members of the Monterey Lodge of the Theosophical Society, later known as the Pacific Grove Lodge in California. 2 years later, Alice Bailey moved south into a cottage on Beechwood Drive to be near Crotona. She reports that about 500 people were involved with the Crotona community then. Alice Bailey's first job was taking out the garbage, but she was quickly promoted to work in the vegetarian kitchen. At Crotona, she encountered fellow Theosophist Foster Bailey, who became her husband. In 1920, the Society's official headquarters moved to Chicago. The Point Loma community moved into a more practical building in Pasadena. The Baileys started their own enterprise, the Lucifer Publishing Company, but too many considered the name a satanic reference, yet again. Alice Bailey found this misunderstanding painful. She was a devout Christian in her own way, as she had been raised. So the Baileys changed the name of their publishing company to Lucis Trust. It's tempting to reflect that her book, Glamour, A World Problem, may have been a reaction to the demise of Crotona in a city that belonged to Hollywood, as we're about to see. Bailey is perhaps best known for being one of those most responsible for popularizing the idea of the New Age. She wrote several metaphysical classics, including her 5-volume A Treatise on the Seven Rays. Perhaps less well known is that Lou Reed, as a young man, in his own words, quote, read all 15 of her books. Apparently, he was never perturbed by the anti-Semitism of her theories. She wrote that Jews brought materialism into this world from another, making of an entire race a symbol of cosmic evil. However, during World War II, Bailey described the Allied and democratic nations as inspired by the masters, and Hitler's Axis as inspired by hatred and evil. Now we step back to 1918, when Crotona was still looking like a success. That was the year Theosophist Christine Stevenson, the Pittsburgh Paint Company heiress from Philadelphia, had the Italian garden at Crotona converted temporarily into a 1,500-seat wooden amphitheater at the head of Vista Del Mar Street. Starlight, crickets, a mockingbird in the canyon added to the enchantment of open-air theater at Tingley's first production, The Light of Asia, an adaptation of a hugely popular poem about the life and teaching of the Buddha with modern choreography and dancing by the peerless Ruth St. Denis, teacher of Martha Graham. Performed nightly 35 times, Tingley's production delighted the audiences. Stevenson's production delighted the audiences more numerous than seating could provide for. Wanting a more permanent location, Stevenson organized some friends into the Theater Arts Alliance. On a Sunday morning early in 1919, she found the perfect spot for her amphitheater. But before it could be built, disagreements caused her to split from her partners. Stevenson decided to sponsor a young man who had become known as Dane Rudger. He joined Crotona on January 1st, 1920. Through St. Denis, he met Martha Graham, which led to his improvising piano music at rehearsals of Graham's first experimental dances. That was the very year that women got the vote. Impatient to begin her theatrical production, Stevenson built the John Anson Ford Amphitheater right across the street from her perfect spot. There she produced a successful Life of Jesus, the pilgrimage play, which is still a tradition. Dane Rudger composed the music. The perfect spot, still owned by the Alliance, would become one of the grandest amphitheaters in the world, the Hollywood Bowl. 25-year-old Rudger had published his first book when he was 18, a study of Debussy's music with 3 of his own piano compositions as a bonus. That same year, he was in the audience in Paris on a Thursday night in May when Ballet Russe premiered Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, choreographed by Nijinsky. The audience howled, whistled, booed, and rioted. Some saw in the violent reaction a foreshadowing of the outbreak of World War I the following year. Teenage Rudger had served as a secretary for the master sculptor Rodin while writing music for Valentine de Saint-Point's La Métachorie, which she called a total fusion of the arts. Lighting, sounds, and her nearly nude dance accompanied her poetry. The author of Manifesto, a Futurist Woman, Saint-Point may have been the first female performance artist. In the late 1930s, Rudger became an influence on art in the American Southwest. A founding member of the Transcendental Painting Group, he wrote their manifesto. He became best known for his brilliant books and articles about astrology, and he was one of those astrologers who brought a deeper vision to the grand old art. His classic book, The Astrology of Personality, became the entry to astrology for many thousands of young astrologers who met his depth with their own and revolutionized astrology in the 20th century. Manly Palmer Hall arrives in Los Angeles in 1919 at the age of 18. His grandmother had raised him. He had inherited her love of theosophy, had enjoyed access to her esoteric library. He had read The Secret Doctrine when most children his age were playing baseball in empty lots. When his grandmother took him to America from Canada, where he'd been born, they moved to different areas of the country. In the Southwest, Hall claimed to have been mentored by an indigenous shaman of high attainment. His quick rise to local, then international fame began with the hearty endorsement of the Theosophical Society in Southern California and of Max Heindel's Rosicrucian Fellowship. Heindel himself had joined the Theosophical Society in Los Angeles a year after moving there, quickly becoming vice president. Hall never met Mr. Heindel, but Max's widow, Mrs. Max Heindel, as Augusta signed her own writing, championed the young man. She taught him how to self-publish books, how to do astrology at a deeper level. He referred to her as mother. In his early years, Manly Hall's own work was deeply influenced by the work of Blavatsky. During his brief time as a sculptor, he sculpted a bust of Blavatsky. Her influence populated especially his early writing with invisible masters and benevolent conspiracies of superior beings. In the 1940s, he filled Carnegie Hall for his lecture about America's secret destiny. I have not found evidence, but it's possible that the popular young lecturer who became a good friend of Krishnamurti lectured at Crotona, Hollywood. If not, Hall surely visited and may have been reminded of it when in the 1930s, he and his first wife, Faye, lived in Frank Lloyd Wright's exotic Mayan monument, perched above the lights of Los Angeles, the Ennis House, best known from its appearance in Blade Runner and the House on Haunted Hill. It was a beautiful and foreboding structure that was difficult to live in. Water would gather in some of the tile work, and then bees would make their nests there. There were leaks all over the place. So the owner had the idea of allowing interesting, creative people to live there. And that's how Manly Hall had the privilege. Crotona must have been a bit of paradise for the few years of its success. Just imagine for a moment, it's 1920. The Roaring Twenties are just getting started. And that was the year where that feeling, because women got the vote and the stock market was doing well and was about to begin this gigantic rise. And so the feeling was that we were entering this new era of prosperity and of enlightenment. And it was a little bit reminiscent of the fantasies, ultimately, of the universal reformation that the Rosicrucians had, that here we were just about to experience this brand new world, brighter world that was filled with spiritual and scientific revelations. So, once again, let us imagine being there in 1920 as the Roaring Twenties begin. Money is loose, and so are morals, especially in Hollywood. You take the streetcar to Primrose. You join the others dressed up divinely to climb the glossy black stairs called the Crotona Flight and emerge into the exotic spiritual realm where you walk in the scents of blossoming jasmine and of orange trees. The lights of the small city of Los Angeles laid out like jewels in the darkness of the basin. Walking past the fanciful buildings and gardens, you might end up in an exotically decorated room to hear a lecture that could change your life. Fortunately, all too soon, Besant and Warrington realized Crotona was a money pit, and the big chunks of cash spent on building it had made it harder to get the money needed to keep it going. Besides, complaints were multiplying. Hollywood had noticed Crotona. New construction was popping up nearby. Actors and other reprehensible Hollywood types were drawn to the Hollywood version of Eden the Theosophical Society had created. It may have reminded them of the sets where they worked. In 1922, Crotona made local headlines again after Besant authorized the sale of acreage to pay off the mortgage and attempt to set up a dependable source of money for expenses. In a public ceremony, the mortgage was burned, but Crotona continued to require much more money than it made. The Hollywood problem quickly became more severe. The famed conductor Leopold Stokowski, a friend of Dane Rudger, brought Greta Garbo there on a date. Moorcrest, the most splendid house built by the Theosophical colonists, had been rented by Charlie Chaplin and then sold to Mary Astor's parents. Astor, a teenage movie star then, dated the much older superstar John Barrymore. These days we'd call it statutory rape. Mary escaped out of Moorcrest's window to get away from her father, but later her first wedding would take place there. Moorcrest's architect, Marie Russick-Hotchner, was an amateur who had never studied architecture, but she had carefully observed the earlier architects building on the site. Her style leaned heavily on Moorish design, but included echoes of Adyar and Art Nouveau decorations. A close friend of Annie Besant, Marie had been an opera singer of renown who had toured Europe and had performed with American band leader John Philip Sousa. Marie became a theosophist in 1896. In 1911, we find her in Minnesota telling a theosophical audience in a Unitarian church, quote, it is perfectly possible for every person to develop within himself the additional vision, which will enable him to see beyond the cloud which hides the dead from the living, end quote. In the local newspaper coverage, she's described as Mrs. Marie Russick of Adyar, India. In 1915, Marie became vice president of the society. A year later, she stepped down because she had committed the infraction of using a Ouija board, which was strictly forbidden. She continued to be a popular lecturer at Crotona, known for charisma. Her audience laughed with her and basked in her affection. Marie became astrologer to John Barrymore and other Hollywood stars. Then she became editor of the Theosophist magazine in the 1930s. The first woman to design houses built in the Hollywood Hills, she created lush environments of exotic glamour. Though professional assessments of her houses have described them as important but vulgar, they continue to charm passersby and lucky visitors. The Hollywood types did not have the ethics or morals of the spiritual seekers of the Theosophical Society, or their appreciation for quiet, vegetarianism, and not smoking. As if to symbolize their encroachment, the Hollywood land housing development had put an end to the unobstructed vistas looking out over undeveloped hillsides of holly bushes, poppies, and sage, with only trees and oak here or there. Soon it would look out over rooftops. The new neighbors planted trees that grew over the years as the canyon became overgrown, as canyons do. The view now takes in what looks like a grove of trees, including magnolia, jacaranda, eucalyptus, carob, citrus. In 1924, Besant gave Warrington permission to sell the whole damn thing to an actor originally from New Zealand who had appeared in and directed more than 100 Hollywood films. By then, Dane Rudger had gone full Hollywood himself. In 1924, he played Jesus Christ in Cecil B. DeMille's silent classic, The Ten Commandments, and reprised the role for 6 months in live performances at Grauman's Theater. When the economy was bad, rooms were rented out in the buildings of Crotona. Years later, Quentin Tarantino lived there. He filmed there for True Romance, completing Hollywood's conquest of Crotona. Eventually, the views to the south and east were partially blocked by new construction, although still quite a beautiful view. Crotona, the community, acquired 115 acres just outside Ojai, a place they described as, quote, impregnated with occult and psychic influences. Warrington chose the spot on a soft hill in a place with an unmistakable aura of beauty. The bookstore, library, esoteric section, and the whole chapter moved to the Ojai Valley. In 1924, architect Robert Stacy Judd had just finished his Route 66 landmark, the Aztec Hotel in Monrovia. Since he used traditional Mayan decorations, why did he call the hotel Aztec? Judd explained average Americans had never heard of the Mayans, but they knew what an Aztec was. Judd's Crotona was built in Spanish mission style and surrounded by beautiful gardens. His most frequently seen building these days is Manly Hall's Philosophical Research Society in Los Feliz, built in 1934. That building's Mayan revival style may have illustrated Judd's ideas about Atlantis, since in 1939 he published his book, Atlantis, Mother of Empires, which included a Mayan carving depicting people fleeing into a boat from a volcano destroying a city. In 1926, 2 years after Theosophy sold Crotona, Society columnist Peggy Nye did an LA Times story about her visit to a cafe opened on the premises. She toured the abandoned Shangri-La, somewhat amused and bemused. The old esoteric section meditation room had been rented by an actor. Its Moorish design may have been a callback to Father CRC, founder of the Rosicrucians, who was said to have received his wisdom in Arabia, but now it was just part of a kooky apartment complex in Hollywood. The old science building was converted into a house. Rooms in other buildings became apartments, and although overgrown and here and there in need of repair, can still be rented. The cats of Crotona, including a lineage said to go back to Theosophical times, add their charm to the considerably less glamorous and yet still enchanting sight. Before closing, we must mention the Besant Lodge, which opened at the mouth of Beechwood Canyon in the 1950s. The small rectangular building began its illustrious history as the first silent movie theater in Los Angeles. In the 30s and 40s, it became a venue for the actors known as the Beechwood Players, including Joan Crawford and Orson Welles. In the 1950s, the Theosophical Society bought the property. Christine Stevenson and other wealthy theosophists who'd remained behind when Crotona went north, same people who created the Hollywood Bowl, hosted lectures there by Manly Hall, Aldous Huxley, and for several decades by Jungian Gnostic bishop, Dr. Holler. Besant Lodge continues many of the traditions of its theosophical incarnation, but is no longer affiliated. In 1917, Grace Nochi became president of the branch of the society that had moved from Point Loma to Altadena. She made classes, the library, and the resources of the Theosophical Society more available to non-members and introduced theosophical correspondence courses. She had been born at Catherine Tingley's Point Loma colony and grew up to guide the society for 35 years. As for Point Loma, none of the grand buildings of Tingley's colony remain, but a few of the smaller ones survive. The property is now owned by a Christian college. The early theosophists debated their use of the word brotherhood because it seemed to exclude women, but they decided it was nevertheless the best choice to convey their meaning. They were very concerned about being accurate with their messages, and yet often fell into controversy. It makes sense to ask the question, what did they and do they really stand for? 1, to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, gender, or caste. 2, to study ancient and modern religions, philosophies, and sciences. 3, to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the psychic powers dormant in human beings. Ironically, we have seen how these powerful women claimed their power through the supermen known as masters, not unlike the women of spiritualism, who believed Plato or Jesus, William James or Hiawatha were giving them the words they spoke before crowds of mostly men who under these specific conditions accepted admonishment from a woman at a lectern. Annie Besant thought the secret masters guiding theosophy gave her the words she spoke in her speeches. Madame Blavatsky claimed that another entity, the writer, shared her body and did the writing. Madame Blavatsky was said not to have the command of English shown in her books, but she did have great editors like Alcott and Wilder. This need to claim power through what may or may not have been imaginary men is a measure of the social conditions in which these women struggled, despite receiving important assistance from the powerful and capable men who respected them. Thank you for giving your attention this Saturday afternoon to the great influence, leadership, and creativity of the women of the Theosophical Society, without whom the cultures of theosophy and the city of Los Angeles would not be the same.
Thank you, Ronnie. Do you have time for a quick Q&A, a few things?
Sure.
Sure, okay. Let's see, the one question says, is asking about other theosophical folks. Thelma Moss at UCLA and her 70s research in parapsychology, and or Judith Orloff is a doctor. Her theory and practice of intuitive empathic medicine, that's kind of her thing. Do those names ring a bell?
They do. There's a few others that I wish I'd had time to mention. And I'm really glad you brought them up because they deserved to be here. But as you can see, it was tough to get all this crammed into 1 hour.
Yeah, that's from Marcia. That's Marcia's question.
Thank you, Marcia.
Let's see. Someone mentions the Theosophy steamers. It's probably the same answer. It's just not enough time to get there,
Exactly.
which would they would travel by train to town and set up a circus tent and give lectures. And you did you come across those in your research?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
It is.
Let's see. Do you know who lives in what people or what kind of people live in the Altadena house? The house in Altadena, which is actually literally catty corner. Like you can't. If I turned it, you would see a wall, but they're super close. Do you know anything about the tenants?
I don't actually. I know that there's a panel there that says that it's the headquarters for the society. So I have noticed that it seems that with the Theosophical Society, there's how do I put this? That people who become elderly in the service of the society seem to benefit from its properties.
Good. And have a final question here. Where is it? It is.
Happy birthday, Lily.
I can't quite find the question, but it was where do you see Theosophy going in the future? You know, when it's not we're not tied to print and physical locations. Do you see it having a renaissance at some point, or is this underway? Or
it's a very interesting question. It's a problem or challenge that I see in other organizations as well, the Rosicrucian fellowships, the various Rosicrucian affiliated public societies, even Freemasonry, where you have this generations of accumulated buildings and books and other resources, and there's not a whole lot of young people getting involved. And it's also expensive to keep up all of these buildings. So for example, in the Rosicrucian Fellowship in California, there's problems with the earthquake code. And the cities and the states involved, they need to update these buildings, but where are they going to get the millions of dollars to do these updates? So there are challenges on the physical side, where they have traditionally had a wealth of resources that kept them going. A place like the Philosophical Research Society has to worry about how are we going to put on a roof so we don't get leaks into the library. And that is something that I find that they're still struggling with across the board to one degree or another, even though there are hopeful signs of creative young people who have become involved and are doing interesting things. Having said that, the work I've done, for example, for the Theosophical Society in Chicago, they are really savvy in terms of how they handle their online presence. At least as somebody who is a speaker, they handle it in such a professional manner, quite unlike most of the experiences that I have that are usually, fairly streamlined and simple. They're on top of all the details, and it's interesting to see the respect that they have for that venue. And so I think that there's definitely the option for them to expand in those directions. But the challenge that they're having is that so many of these ideas, Theosophy, Freemasonry, have been slandered, if you will, depending on your belief systems. Maybe there's some truth to some of it, but they've taken on this idea that there are secret conspiracies. Theosophy was said to be related to the Nazis because the Nazis were inspired by aspects of it. And in fact, Theosophists in Germany were sent to concentration camps. But the idea that Theosophy is somehow Nazi friendly still circulates out there. How anybody who is talking about universal brotherhood for all could be seen as racist, depending on the behavior of the individual, of course, but as an organization, it's illogical. So the same thing, of course, with the Masons, who are constantly being attacked as being this evil elite, and they carry this baggage with them. And so it's ironic that for so many hungry young people looking for knowledge, and these amazing organizations which are essentially repositories of knowledge and have collected all of this, and organized it and put it into books, and that they don't reach each other very well at the moment. And so my hope is that we'll be seeing more people who champion them. And I noticed that recently Mitch Horowitz has been doing a series of classes for them, and I'll be doing a series of classes for them later this year. And we need people to bring attention to them and to help people realize what a rich heritage they really represent. As I hope this talk today has shown listeners the amazing creativity and the audacity of the creativity of these men and women. And that should still be there in the society. And I would hope that women in particular would be attracted to Theosophy, because traditionally that is where they have gained great power in the metaphysical world.
Great answer. Well, yeah, we're going to have to wrap up in a moment, but I did want to mention that if you are in Altadena or near, we do have most of her, her Isis Unveiled. We've got Secret Doctrine. We've got books about Blavatsky. And also it's a lovely library. So, if you're around and you come to see the Theosophical locations, pop into the library too. It's really lovely. Also wanted to mention that we have Ronnie's book at the library, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. We have that. And yeah, so Ronnie, bravo. That was just a tour de force of amazing information and just beautifully presented. Thank you so much. Would you like to say some final words?
Just if anybody has any questions after the fact, please reach out to me at the Ronnie Pontiac on Instagram. And Marcia, I'd love to be in touch with you. Anybody you can ask that question, I'd like to follow. That's it.
Yes. And also just a final thank you to Anne and Lily Rose, who the other two questions.
Happy birthday,
right, Ronnie,
again, Lily.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for everybody for coming.
Mark, wish Lily a happy birthday.
Lily, happy birthday.
Thank you.
All right, folks, have a great weekend. And thank you again, Ronnie.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.
Bye-bye.